Hello and welcome to the Healing Powers of Tea course. This entire course is about the art and science of making tea. The act of combining water and herbs is our most foundational herbal remedy. It's also one of our most versatile preparations. A cup of tea can be a delicious beverage shared with friends. Making the tea can be a meditation, an act of practicing presence. Brewing it can be an art form, and yet a simple tea can also soothe your sore throat, calm your nerves, or boost your immune system. I'm Rosalie de la Forêt, your host for this course. I'm an herbalist, author of the best-selling book, Alchemy of Herbs, and I'm a tea lover. I was inspired to create a course entirely on teas because I feel like they're often dismissed. More and more, I see people declare that teas are weak or that one should always use tinctures or essential oils, and I couldn't disagree more. In this course, I'll be showing you how to make herbal medicinal teas that are safe as well as very effective. At its simplest, tea is a combination of water and plants. And like anything in life, we can make this as easy or as complicated as we want. So here's what we'll be exploring in this course. In this first part, we're going to be discussing about how to get the best ingredients, which are water and herbs. We're also going to be talking about dosage. In part 2, you'll be getting my tips for getting the best supplies, and we'll be exploring how to make different preparations of tea. And in part 3, we'll be making sense of herbal formulations and showing you how you can create your own herbal formulas for making tea, as well as tips for making that perfect cup of tea. To get the most out of this course, I recommend getting rid of any distractions. I create highly visual presentations, so you're going to want to be watching as well as listening. You have 2 handouts for this course. One is a recipe ebook filled with my favorite tea recipes, and I've also created a simple workbook for you to follow along with. I find that following along, filling in the blanks, writing questions, etc., can really help you to stay present and engage with the materials. Of course, if you don't find it helpful, it's entirely optional. But I would download it and check it out because there's some resources listed at the end that you'll probably find helpful. Well, before we get to the hows of tea, let's explore the whys of tea. So I mentioned herbal tea is a foundational part of herbalism, but there can be some downsides to tea. It can be messy. Spilling a bottle of capsules is a very different experience than spilling your cup of tea. Another downside is that for some people, making tea can seem like an inconvenience. It's certainly not as easy as popping capsules. And then, of course, there's the taste of some teas, especially our medicinal teas. They can taste bitter or otherwise harsh. There's also many gifts and benefits for herbal tea. It is really easy to make. It's very inexpensive, it's safe, and it can also be highly effective at both supporting and restoring good health. So in other words, we can enjoy tea simply as a delicious drink, or we can rely on it for our medicine. And tea is a bit different from other herbal medicines because there's this prolonged experience in both the making and drinking of the tea. But it doesn't have to be an inconvenience. Making and sipping a cup of tea can be part of the healing process. We all know that savoring a cup of an herbal tea is a very different feeling than popping a few herbal capsules, or even using some squirts of herbal tinctures. Dr. Tirona Lodog says, "I'm not sure how much healing can really be experienced when you're sucking back a couple of capsules with a swallow of water on your way running out the door to go to work. There's something more profound that happens when you actually sit and prepare tea. You have to boil the water. You see the loose herbs. You pour the water over the herbs. You let it steep. You strain the chamomile. You sit down. You drink the tea slowly because it's hot. If you allow it, it can be a totally meditative experience." So my hope is that you'll leave this course feeling inspired about tea and its many gifts. I'm going to show you how simple it is to make tea by giving you my best tips and by making sure you have the right tools and supplies. I'm also going to share some delicious herbal tea recipes with you in this presentation and in your ebook. And I'm also going to show you how to customize tea to your preferences. So let's begin by looking at our ingredients. So, ingredients needed for tea, very simple: water plus herbs. And as herbalists, we tend to spend a lot of time thinking about the herbs, but we can't forget how important the water is. The Dalai Lama says, "However the tea is prepared, the primary ingredient is always water. While we can live without tea, we can't live without water." So we want to use the best water that's available to us. Some tea experts will tell you that you should only use freshly fallen rain, or you should only use distilled water, or water that comes directly from an alpine spring. Those can be great options, but they aren't available to all of us. The best water you can use is both the cleanest and the easiest that you can find. For many of us, that will mean purified tap water. If it's possible for you, avoid water that's been bottled in individual plastic bottles. In addition to the health concerns from plastic leaching into the water, there's also the consideration of environmental waste. When we make herbal tea, we're basically extracting chemicals and nutrients from the herbs and into the water. Water is called the universal solvent because it's capable of dissolving more substances than any other liquid. That not only makes water a powerful extractor of herbal materials, but this is important to every living thing on Earth. Wherever water flows on this earth, whether it's the rain falling from the sky, rivers running through the earth, or water coursing through our own bodies, it's also transporting valuable chemicals, minerals, and a wide range of nutrients. Our bodies are somewhere around 60% water, and when drinking tea, herbs often get all the attention, but drinking life-giving and sustaining water is also an important part of tea's healing abilities. The other half of making herbal teas is, of course, the herbs themselves. Ideally, we want to use the freshest and most vibrant, high-quality herbs that we can find. This often means herbs that were grown organically in healthy soils without the use of harmful pesticides, herbicides, or harsh chemical fertilizers. It means herbs that have been harvested from healthy plants and they were harvested at the correct time and the correct part where it's harvested as well. In the resource section of your handout, I list several options for getting the best herbs, and that's growing your own, finding local herb farmers and apothecaries, to buying herbs in bulk online from places like Mountain Rose Herbs. So one question I often see is, should I use fresh or dried plants when making tea? The answer is you can use either. I recommend experimenting with both, as they both have their unique gifts. In general, however, we use dried herbs for tea. Dried herbs are more easily extracted into water, and depending on the time of year, they're often more convenient. Sometimes people wonder if drying plants somehow destroys or diminishes their medicinal properties. For the most part, dried herbs are still powerfully medicinal. In this presentation, I'll be sharing recipes for both dried and fresh herbs. Herbal tea can be made from any part of the plant, including the leaves and flowers, roots, barks, and seeds. So let's take a closer look at each of these, and I'll share some tips for making sure you have vibrant plant material. The aerial portions of plants, or the above ground parts of plants, are the most common herbs to make tea from. When dried, aerial herbs should retain most of their original color. So if the leaves were green when fresh, they should be green when dried. If the flowers were purple when fresh, they should still be purple when dried. They should also maintain that vibrant smell and feel. So if an herb is really aromatic when fresh, like for an example, rosemary or thyme, they should still have that strong smell when they're dried. Another thing I'm often asked about is stems. Is it okay to use stems in your herbal tea? Well, if the stems are hard and woody, I wouldn't use them. If they don't have a lot of taste or smell, they're probably not going to add a lot to your tea. There's not really concern in using them, though. They just might not have a lot of medicinal value. Well, here's a comparison of chamomile. So we can't give these a smell test, but we can assume that the chamomile on the left is either quite old or perhaps it wasn't harvested and dried in a good way, while the dried chamomile on the right looks vibrant. So I know which chamomile I'd want to use in my tea, and that's basically what we're looking for in all herbs. Do they look fresh? Do they look vibrant? Are they still holding all of their medicinal qualities within them? Depending on the plant, roots can vary a lot in their appearance, but still the same principles apply, such as the smell and the look. Ideally, when making teas or decoctions with dried roots, you want them to be already cut and sifted because whole dried roots are often difficult to make smaller. Seeds should often also retain their aromatics. Oftentimes it helps to crush the seeds a bit before using them for tea. This helps break open their protective shells. We also use barks in tea, and again, these are best extracted when there's a lot of surface area. So the smaller they are, the better. They could be even smaller than you see in this photo. Can you use powders as teas? Technically you can, but they can be very hard to filter out. So some people don't mind mixing powder into water and then drinking it all, and some people don't mind fussing with the straining methods to straighten out the powder. But for the most part, I prefer not to use powders to make tea. There's some exceptions though. With something like cayenne, generally when using cayenne powder to make a tea, we're using so little of the cayenne powder that it really dissolves in the water quite well. In your recipe ebook, you have a recipe for cayenne powder tea. So are there any herbs that aren't good for teas? Well, basically any plant can be made into a tea. But there are some herbs that really wouldn't be my first choice for a tea. For example, extremely bitter herbs can be difficult to drink. So as a result, I don't really drink Oregon grapefruit tea or andrographis tea because these are especially bitter, and therefore they're just hard to swallow. And while water does dissolve most substances, as we talked about it being the universal solvent, it doesn't play well with fats, with oils, and to some degree, resins. Resins like myrrh or resinous plants like cottonwood buds are a challenge as a tea, and they're often better extracted with alcohol. That being said, simmering evergreen needles such as Douglas fir or pine does pull out some of the resin, so they can still be used as a tea. In terms of storage or shelf life, there's really no set date on when an herb is, quote, bad. Unless an herb wasn't dried well and it gets moldy, dried herbs don't really go bad. They just slowly lose their pizzazz over time. To increase the shelf life of your herbs, you want to store them in their whole form as much as possible. So whole aerial parts like whole flowers and whole leaves, those are going to store better and last longer than herbal powders, as an example. You also want to store dried herbs in a glass jar with a tight fitting lid. And you want to keep them in a dark place. So how long does an herb last in your cupboard? It really depends on the plant, how it was harvested, dried, and stored. The best way to tell if an herb is still good is to use your senses. If it looks, smells, and tastes vibrant, then it is. Admittedly, sometimes I don't go through my herbs as fast as I should and they've faded a bit. So I use my senses to determine how I'm going to use them. If there's just a bit lacking in appearance and taste, and I can tell they're just not, freshly dried material, I can still make a tea out of them, but maybe in that case, I'll use more herbs just to get a little bit more oomph into the tea. But if they don't really inspire me for teas, then depending on the herb, I may add them to soup stocks, or I might make a really big, strong tea and then pour that into my bath water. And then sometimes if they're really lacking in potency, I'll just send them on to the compost. When you're first starting out as an herbalist or someone who's making a lot of teas, it can be hard to figure out how much of an herb to harvest or to buy. Honestly, it's still something I'm figuring out. I recently didn't dry nearly enough lemon balm to last me through the year. And I got out of it already and had to order some. And then I just recently ordered way more chamomile than I could possibly use. So I've been gifting that to friends and using it as a bath herb. So, in buying herbs or harvesting herbs, my recommendation is to stick with small quantities and avoid buying pounds or gathering pounds of something until you have a really good idea of how much you might need. All right, to sum up this section on ingredients, we want the purest water and the most vibrant herbs possible when making tea. My dad often tells me that the beginning of a good meal starts with the best ingredients, and that's certainly true for teas as well. All All right, the next section is on dosage. And this is admittedly a huge and often confusing topic in Western herbalism. And that's because herbal dosages vary from plant to plant and from person to person. And while not having a set standard for all herbs can be a bit overwhelming, it's actually one of the strengths of herbalism because we can really fine-tune the dosage to really match the person well. So the first thing I want to clear up is that herbal dosages do not depend on the cups of tea you drink. So in other words, when you read about an herb and the recommended dosage is 3 cups of tea, that's basically useless information. When figuring out dosage, what you really need to know is how much of the actual herb do you use per cup or even daily. The amount of water that you use to make the tea is more of a preference or a practical approach. So take thyme, for example. Let's say that the recommended dosage for thyme is 1 teaspoon of dried thyme. You could use as much or as little water that you wanted, with the understanding that you need enough to extract the thyme. So if you're using 1 teaspoon of dried thyme, you're going to need more than 1 teaspoon of water, for example. But you don't want to use so much water that you're struggling to drink it all. So you wouldn't want to infuse a teaspoon of dried thyme into a gallon of water, right? It's going to be very diluted and you're going to have a lot of water to drink. Sometimes suggested dosages for herbs are given in a daily amount. So it might say that 9 grams of an herb is recommended per day. Depending on the circumstances or preference, that could be taken at once or it could be broken up into different servings. For the most part, it's best to measure herbs by weight rather than by volume. And that's because herbs come in all shapes and sizes, and those can vary greatly even between the same herb. Let's say both you and I harvest dandelion roots in our yards, and then we bring them inside, wash them off, we cut them up, and we dry them. Chances are they're going to be very different sizes. Maybe you mince yours up really finely, and I'm just going to hack mine into a bit smaller pieces. So if you measure those by volume, by which I mean by teaspoon or by the cup or whatever, that means that the dosage amount is going to vary greatly because of the different sizes of the roots. To virtually show this, I measured out 1 tablespoon of shredded astragalus root and 1 tablespoon of chopped astragalus. So even though I used the same volume measurement, you can see there was a huge difference between the actual amount of herbs, 3 grams versus 9 grams. Of course, like with anything, you can go overboard, and sometimes it doesn't make sense to weigh out herbs instead of using volume. So if you're using small amounts of herbs for pleasurable tea, then it's easier to measure out a teaspoon or a tablespoon. Or if you're measuring out something that has fairly uniform in size, like seeds are pretty much always the same size, then volume measurements are reliable as well. Another thing to consider when you're figuring out the dosage for herbal teas is if you're making a tea for pleasure, say a nice comforting cup at the end of the day, or a tea party with friends, or if you're making a tea where you have a specific desired result in mind, such as relieving a cough or lessening anxiety. In general, we use more herbs for medicinal teas and less herbs for pleasurable teas, which of course isn't to say you can't have a tasty herbal tea that's also an effective remedy. Take ginger tea, for example. You can make a ginger, lemon, and honey tea that tastes great, but also helps with a variety of cold and flu symptoms such as a sore throat or congestion. Ginger tea can also be a delicious way to support healthy digestion or even to relieve an upset stomach. Even still, I find that I use varying amounts of ginger depending on the situation. Smaller amounts of ginger taste better to me, and they're sufficient to kind of warm me up on a cold winter's day, where larger amounts of ginger make a more intense, spicy tea, but one that can be more effectively used to relieve stuck congestion or an upset stomach. So in many cases, when it comes to dosage, we start with this idea of how much to use. And then it's through personal experimentation that we figure out what's best for us in a given situation. To further show you this, I have a nettle tea experiment for you, which can be found in your recipe ebook. This experiment is comparing the differences in dosage and in steeping times. So basically, you're going to make nettle tea in 2 ways and then see the results. And when you look at this, even if you think you have a pretty good idea of the differences between these preparations, I really recommend actually doing this experience. It's by physically doing something that we really learn. And if you just simply read about it without doing it, it's unlikely that you're going to remember or gain deeper insights. Really involving our senses in the learning process is the best way to really get something. So again, that's in your recipe ebook. So where do you even begin to find suggested dosages? Well, in the reference section of your handout, I've listed some books that you see here as well, and these books contain dosage recommendations. Not all herbal books list dosages. Some list general dosages, like for aerial portions, use this amount, and for roots, use this amount, but I really don't like that. The deepest understanding comes from knowing individual dosage range from individual plants, not simply generally plant parts. But I will say that no matter where you get your dosage information from, remember it's a starting dosage idea. So as I said earlier, there's no consistent dose for herbs. Instead, it's the vibrancy of the herb, the reason we're using it, and even the person it's being used for that help determine what a starting dosage might be. So by now, you can see how dosage is a big deal and it can be a bit of confusing. But as confusing as it might be at first, ultimately it leads us to more freedom and individualization. So while we can't easily say, take 2 of these and call me in the morning, we can choose the best dosage for the herb and the person so that they get the best results. I do have some more practical tips for you. When figuring out the dosage for a medicinal cup of tea, have an idea of the recommended dosage. And remember, you can use the books I listed as an example. Then you want to know the person the herbs are for. Do they need more or less? Generally, people that weigh less or are more sensitive to things they drink or eat need less herbs than someone who's larger or isn't sensitive. And people often know this, like they know that they might take, less of over-the-counter medicine, for example, than other people, or they know that they're just sensitive to the things that they eat. So that can be one insight there. And whatever you choose, it's always a good idea to start low. Then you can increase the amount of the herbs to really find the maximum benefit without adverse effects. Of course, dosage for yummy tea is a little bit different than dosage for medicinal tea. Again, you want to have an idea of the recommended herb dosage, and then you just add more or less depending on your personal taste preference, what tastes good to you. So it's a matter of making a tea, testing it out, seeing if you like it, adding more or less herbs depending on what you like. And really over time, you get this developed sense of intuition for using the best amount of herbs for you. Another thing to consider with herbal dosage is how often do you drink the tea? This really varies from herb to herb, but especially it varies with the reason why you're taking the tea. If it's for pleasure, drink away as desired. If you're wanting to address an acute situation like preventing the onset of a cold or flu or addressing chronic stress and anxiety, then drinking smaller amounts of tea more frequently throughout the day will be ideal. Another example is that if you're drinking some tea to relieve a sore throat, frequent sips throughout the day is going to be a lot more effective than drinking 16 ounces in one gulp. Which leads me to the question, can you drink too many cups of tea? Yeah, you can, but unless you're using an herb that should only be used in small quantities, I would just let your body decide how much is enough. Of course, if you're peeing every 2 minutes because you're drinking huge quantities of tea, that's probably too much. Or if you feel adverse to this tea that you've been drinking because you simply overdid it, then I'd listen to that too. The most common side effect of drinking too much herbal tea is frequent urination or feeling maybe that your stomach gets upset. One herb that does come to mind to pay attention to, though, is licorice root. I've noticed that, especially when someone is sick, they can drink a lot of licorice root tea because it can soothe their throat and they like the taste. It's very sweet. But for many people, excessive amounts of licorice tea can cause temporary high blood pressure. So that's one I wouldn't drink consistently in large dosages. So while most herbs are safe, it's always a good idea to know the plants you're drinking and to know if there are any special considerations for that particular plant. Another question I often hear is folks wondering if they should take a break from a tea that they're drinking regularly. I'd say if you're enjoying a tea, craving it even, and therefore drinking it regularly, there's no rule that says you have to stop it for a while. That is a common myth that gets spread around a lot. However, I think there's something to be said for paying attention to how you feel on any given day or throughout the seasons, and then choosing your teas accordingly. So sometimes there's teas in our lives that we depend on daily to support our health. Often these are our nutrient-dense teas, sort of akin to Popeye eating his spinach daily, like stinging nettle comes to mind. But even when we're getting specific care for our health challenges, the herbs we take often change as our health changes. So if you've ever been under an herbalist's care, you probably noticed that your herbal formulas are shifting all the time. They don't remain static for months or for years. So while there isn't really a hard rule about taking breaks from an herb, I also encourage you to question the use of your herbs from time to time and make sure it's what you're really wanting or even needing. So, in other words, don't get stagnant with your teas. All right, well, you've just learned about getting the best ingredients for tea, both with water and with herbs. And we also went over dosage to show you how you can use both references as well as your preferences as a guide to figure out the dosage for teas. In part 2, I'll be covering some tips for getting the best supplies as well as showing you different ways you can make tea. I'll see you there.